There are some afternoons in the American West when the golden light makes everything look like a painting. But there are other afternoons when justice stays silent and human lives are traded like cattle. This was one of those afternoons. Millfield, Kansas. A seemingly ordinary Tuesday. Dust hangs low on Main Street. A lazy wind stirs the faded sign of the Silver Dollar Saloon. And right in the center of town, a 19-year-old girl stands on a wooden platform, shaking, ashamed, and utterly alone. Her name is Cordelia May. Her dark hair clings to her face, her eyes swollen from tears. She's wearing a thin white dress and clutches at it as if it could shield her from the humiliation raining down. All around her, men bark out numbers. Miners, drifters, ranch hands, laughing and leering like they're bidding on a mare. $50, $7,100. The voices jeer, the crowd thickens. At the edge of the chaos stands Silas Crowder, the saloon owner and self-appointed auctioneer. His gold tooth glints as he slams the gavel down with glee, shouting, "What we've got here, gentlemen, is a genuine virgin, fresh as morning dew." But just then something no one expected happened. The batwing doors creaked open, and through them stepped a man with dirt on his boots and grief in his eyes, Thaddeus Holloway. He wasn't there to be a hero. He was just a farmer, a widower, a father who came into town for medicine and supplies before the sun dipped too low. But instead of ointment and oats, he found a girl being auctioned like livestock. Their eyes met just for a moment. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. A plea, a flicker of hope, a memory of his own daughter Minerva and the kind of world he wanted her to grow up in. Why would a man risk his livelihood and even the safety of his child for a stranger? And what happens when doing the right thing comes at a higher price than you ever imagined? This isn't just a story about a girl on a platform. It's a story about courage, about compassion, about standing up when no one else will. So come with me back to that dusty afternoon in Millfield, where a girl was being sold and a man bought something he didn't even know he was looking for. A reason to believe again, a reason to fight, a reason to hope. There are few moments in a person's life when time seems to stop. Not because something beautiful has happened, but because something unthinkable is unfolding right in front of them. Cordelia May was only 19, but that Tuesday afternoon in Millfield, Kansas, she felt 1,000 years old. She stood on a wooden platform in the center of town, barefoot and shaking, wearing a thin white dress that clung to her frame in the heat. Her hands trembled as she tried to cover herself as if decency could be held together by sheer will alone. She didn't cry anymore, not because she didn't want to, but because she was too tired. There were no tears left, only shame and silence. They were auctioning her, like cattle. Around her, the crowd of rough men grew louder. Miners with soot-stained hands, ranchers with spurs that scraped against the wood, drifters with no names and no pasts. They shouted numbers, laughed at each other's bids, made crude jokes. But none of them, not one, looked at her like she was human. At the edge of the crowd stood Silas Crowder, the saloon owner and self-appointed auctioneer. His gold tooth gleamed in the sun as he raised his gavel and hollered with the enthusiasm of someone enjoying the degradation. "Gentlemen, a genuine virgin fresh as spring water. Bidding starts at $50. Cordelia didn't flinch. She just stood there. Let them look. Let them bid. Maybe the fastest way to end the nightmare was to stop resisting it. What none of them knew, what no one cared to ask, was how she ended up there. She had no family. Her father, once a good man, had lost everything to whiskey and cards. When he died, Silas Crowder claimed his debts passed to her. She tried to work it off, scrubbing floors, washing dishes, sewing late into the night. But it was never enough. And now, here she stood, not as a debtor, but as payment itself. From somewhere in the back, a new voice called out, 70, then another. 85. Her eyes searched the crowd, not for help, not anymore. Just for one kind face, one pair of eyes that didn't burn through her like fire. And that's when she saw him. A man at the edge of the saloon mud, still on his boots, sun on his shoulders. He looked like a farmer, maybe 40, with eyes that spoke of sorrow. And something else, kindness. They locked eyes. She didn't know him. But in that moment she needed him. And what neither of them could know was that he needed her too. Because sometimes the line between savior and saved blurs in the dust. Sometimes a girl on a platform and a man in mourning are exactly what the other needs to find their humanity again. And when he finally raised his voice and said, $200? Millfield fell silent. Not because the bidding had ended, but because something deeper had just begun. And that's where we meet Clara, the woman who would change everything with just one choice and a look that saw straight through Thomas Whitmore's shame. Thaddeus Holloway hadn't planned to be a hero that day. He came to town for medicine flour, maybe a coil of rope. Nothing more. His little girl Minerva was waiting back at the farm, probably on the porch with her nose in a book she barely understood. She'd been asking about her mother again. He didn't have the right answers, only silence and a tired smile. But then he heard the shouting, then the crying, and something in his chest, something that had been buried beneath years of grief and quiet, broke open. He stepped through the bat-wing doors of the Silver Dollar Saloon expecting noise, maybe a card game. Instead, he found a young woman standing on a wooden platform, eyes wide with terror, surrounded by men bidding on her like she was a thing, not a person, not someone's daughter. And in that moment, he saw his own daughter standing there, just a few years older. If the world ever turned cruel enough, he couldn't let it happen. Not again. His hand reached into his pocket, fingers brushing over the money meant for survival food for winter. Cough syrup for Minerva seed for next season's planting. $93, that was all. But his heart? It had already decided. $200, he said. The room went quiet. Silas Crowder raised his gavel almost giddy. Buck Morrison's jaw tightened. Everyone knew the kind of man Buck was, violent, possessive, and the last bidder before Thaddeus spoke. But Thaddeus didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his voice steady but his hands trembling. Hands made for plowing fields, not for drawing guns. "This girl's coming home with me," he said quietly, "but not for the reason y'all think." A nervous laugh rippled through the room. Silas banged the gavel. Sold. And just like that, she was his. Cordelia. He didn't even know her name yet. But her face, frightened, bruised by life, but not broken, was already etched into his soul. She asked him one question as she stepped down from the platform, voice barely a whisper. "You're not going to—" "No, ma'am," he said, his voice low and kind. "You'll have food, shelter, and respect. Nothing more expected." For a brief moment she breathed. The nightmare wasn't over. But just maybe, it had been interrupted. Then Buck Morrison stepped in front of them, hand near his pistol, eyes gleaming with a cruel smile. "Nobody spends $200 on charity," he growled. "What's your real game, farmer?" And Thaddeus knew right there in that moment that his choice had a cost. He'd bought Cordelia's freedom. But now someone wanted blood for the price. And so it begins not just a rescue, but a reckoning. Because in a town ruled by debt, violence, and men who think they own everything, standing up for one girl might mean putting your whole world at risk. Outside, the sun still shone, casting warm light over the dusty main street of Millfield. But for Thaddeus Holloway, it suddenly felt like winter. Cordelia stood beside him, her hands trembling even though he'd promised she was safe. The way she flinched when Buck Morrison stepped closer told him otherwise. Buck wasn't yelling now, he didn't have to. His grin said everything. "You got two choices," Farmer Buck said, hand grazing the grip of his pistol. "Walk away, or walk into something you can't walk out of." That's when Cordelia leaned in, voice shaking but urgent. "He's not just cruel," she whispered. "He's killed before." Thaddeus turned toward her, confused. 3 months ago, she continued. "A preacher's daughter tried to run. Buck found her. She never came home. And the sheriff, he buried it." Her words dropped like stones in Thaddeus's stomach. He knew the sheriff wasn't exactly trustworthy. But to cover a murder, that meant Buck wasn't just evil. He was protected. Thaddeus scanned the saloon, 3 of Buck's men near the door, 2 more leaning against the bar. They weren't interested in drinks. They were here to make sure Cordelia didn't leave. Or if she did, she didn't make it far. And just when Thaddeus thought the day couldn't twist any crueler, he heard the softest voice in the world call out behind him, "Papa." He turned, and there she was, Minerva, his little girl, running straight into the lion's den with her blonde braids bouncing and her smile still innocent. She'd disobeyed. She'd come to town, and now she was standing in the middle of something far too dark for an 8-year-old heart to bear. Cordelia reached for his sleeve, whispering, "He's going to use her, Thaddeus. He's going to use her against you." He already was. Buck's gaze slid toward Minerva, and his grin widened. "That's a mighty pretty daughter you've got there, Holloway. Be a shame if something happened to her, on account of your pride." For Thaddeus, it was no longer about money, not even about right or wrong. It was about what a man chooses to stand for when the world demands he kneel. He pulled Minerva behind him, gently shielding her with his body. "You touch one hair on her head, you'll," what Buck sneered. "You ain't even armed, farmer." Thaddeus looked around. A silent crowd had formed, shopkeepers, townsfolk, faces pressed to windows and porches, watching, waiting. He raised his voice, not angry, not scared, just tired of it all. "You think this is just between you and me, Buck? Look around. Half this town's watching you threaten a child because her father dared to stop you from buying a woman like she was cattle." And that's when something began to shift. The onlookers, people too scared to speak before, began murmuring. Whispers became voices. One by one, they stepped forward. Reverend Mills, Doc Whitman, shopkeeper Chen, all of them armed. All of them tired of pretending they didn't see. "We've had enough of your bullying, Morrison," Doc Whitman said. And just like that, evil so loud moments before stood blinking in the sunlight. Not so powerful after all. But evil doesn't retreat easily. And predators, when cornered, always bite back. The world slowed as Thaddeus crouched beside Minerva, shielding her from the shadows that now seemed to stretch longer than the day itself. She had no idea what she'd walked into. No idea that her presence had just tilted the balance of power, and not in their favor. "Papa, who is this man?" she asked, her small voice rising into the hush of a saloon now silent with dread. Thaddeus swallowed hard. How do you explain cruelty to a child who still believes every adult is good? Cordelia knelt beside her, voice soft, steady. "Sweetheart, my name's Cordelia. Your papa's helping me because I'm in trouble. Bad trouble." Minerva looked up, her eyes wide, the same blue as her mother's. The same trusting spark that reminded Thaddeus of better days of fireflies and bedtime stories and a world before death and desperation had stolen her innocence. "Mama used to say Papa always helps people who are hurting," she whispered. "She said that's what makes a man good." Thaddeus felt something crack in his chest. How could he explain that goodness came with a price? That helping others sometimes meant gambling, everything, even your child's safety? From across the square, Buck watched. He saw the connection, the vulnerability, and like any predator, he struck where it would hurt the most. "Tell you what," Farmer Buck called out louder now, his voice cutting through the warm Kansas air like a blade. "Leave the girl here with me and you all walk away. No more threats, no more blood. Your daughter gets to grow up with a daddy." The words echoed. Every parent in that crowd felt the weight of the moment. Every father thought, what would I do if that were my child? For Thaddeus, it was the worst kind of choice, one that tore him down the middle. Sacrifice Cordelia, or risk Minerva. His daughter tugged on his coat, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm scared, Papa." He knelt down again, looked her in the eyes. "Me too, honey. But being brave doesn't mean we're not scared. It means we don't let fear decide who we are." Then he rose, turned to face Buck. His voice was low, but it carried. "You want to know who I am, Buck? I'm the man who's not for sale. Not today. Not ever." Buck's smirk faltered. For the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes. Because real courage spreads like wildfire, and it had just found dry ground. But Thaddeus knew better than to think this was over. Not by a long shot. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows down Millfield streets, a storm was gathering. Not in the sky, but in the hearts of men who were about to make the most dangerous mistake of all, threaten a child. They stood in the middle of the street, three souls bound not by blood, but by something stronger choice. Thaddeus Holloway had nothing in his hands but dirt and principle. Buck Morrison had a cold .45 resting on his hip and 5 men ready to draw on a nod. "You sure you want to die for a girl you just met?" Farmer Buck asked loud enough for every ear on Main Street to hear. Thaddeus didn't flinch. Not because he wasn't scared, he was terrified. His knees trembled beneath him, his hands ached to shake. But fear had its place. It kept men alive. Courage. That kept them human. He took a breath, feeling Minerva's small fingers clutching his shirt, feeling Cordelia's fragile hope clinging to his silence. Then he spoke. "You're right, Buck. I'm not armed." A few chuckles came from Buck's men, cruel and confident. "But you're wrong about one thing," Thaddeus added. "You think this is between you and me." He gestured subtly not to a weapon, but to the crowd. People had emerged from shops leaned out of windows. Miners, clerks, wives, and children, all watching. "Half this town just saw you threaten an 8-year-old girl because her daddy wouldn't let you buy a woman like cattle. The other half will hear about it before sunset." Buck shifted in the saddle unease, replacing bravado. That's when it changed. That's when silence stopped being fear and became witness. "You gun me down now," Thaddeus continued, "and Sheriff Palmer might look away. But Judge Crawford won't. And neither will the marshal coming through next week." A tremor passed through the watching crowd. Courage is contagious. And Thaddeus Holloway, a widowed farmer with no gun and no backup, had just stood taller than any badge or bullet. Buck's jaw clenched. His hand hovered near his revolver. But even a man like him knew when he was cornered not by steel, but by story. Because once a man's cruelty is named in front of a town, he doesn't get to rewrite that tale. "You win this round," Buck spat, backing his horse away. "But Millfield's a small place. Roads get mighty lonely after dark." Thaddeus didn't answer. He just turned gently, lifting Minerva onto the saddle, helping Cordelia climb behind. Then he looked back one last time, voice steady as the earth. "My name's Thaddeus Holloway, and you won't need a grave marker, because I don't plan on dying today." As the hoofbeats faded behind them, the sun dipped low, casting long orange streaks across the prairie. But peace wouldn't follow them far, because just beyond the ridgeline, someone was watching. Someone who wasn't ready to let go of revenge. Devil's Canyon had never been kind to travelers. Its jagged cliffs and narrow pass held more memories than wind. Some whispered, some screamed. And today, it would write another name into the stone. Thaddeus had hoped they could make it home before the dark. He hadn't counted on the ambush. The first shot cracked through the stillness, sending a plume of dust inches from his horse's hooves. The second struck a rock beside Cordelia's head. Then came silence, the kind that means someone is watching. He pulled the reins sharply, guiding them behind a boulder, just wide enough to cover all 3 of them. "Stay down," he whispered, shielding Minerva and Cordelia with his body. From the ridges above, Buck's voice floated down like poison. "Thought you were real clever back in town, farmer. But out here, there ain't no judge, no crowd, just me and payback." Cordelia trembled beside him, but her voice was clear. "Give me to him. Please, don't let him hurt your daughter." Thaddeus looked at her, this girl who'd been treated like property, now offering herself again to save someone else. "Nobody's giving you to anybody," he said softly. "Not anymore." He reached into his coat for the tiny Derringer Doc Whitman had given him. 2 bullets, 6 enemies, hopeless odds, unless... Then, like a distant prayer, answered hoofbeats echoed from behind. Dozens of them, fast, purposeful. And then a voice. One Thaddeus hadn't dared to hope for. "This is Judge Crawford. Drop your weapons. You're surrounded." Buck's men froze. Thaddeus risked a glance. Through the canyon mist, he saw them. Doc Whitman, Reverend Mills, Harold Chen, the shopkeeper, and nearly a dozen more townsfolk, armed and riding with fire in their eyes. These were not lawmen. They were neighbors, witnesses, men who'd had enough. Buck cursed. "You got no authority out here. My authority rides with me," the judge shouted. "And my rifle speaks louder than your threats." For a moment, no one moved. Even the air seemed to pause. Then Cordelia. This girl once sold like cattle rose from behind the boulder. Slowly, deliberately. Her voice shook, but her truth didn't. Buck Morrison, you want to know why Crowder sold me so fast? Why he never told you I had family? She raised her chin. Because he's been stealing from you. For months. The canyon held its breath, and Buck the Predator blinked. Because truth, when spoken in front of witnesses, is more dangerous than any gun. The tide had turned. But the danger wasn't gone, not yet. Cordelia's voice trembled, but not with fear, with the weight of finally being heard. She stood tall in that canyon, her small frame silhouetted against the burning sun as the entire valley seemed to hold its breath. Even Buck's horse shifted beneath him, sensing the shift in power and maybe something far older truth. I kept his books, she said, her voice echoing off the rocks. Silas Crowder's. For 3 months. Every sale, every head of cattle. I saw it all. Thaddeus turned to look at her. He hadn't known this, hadn't guessed that the quiet girl he'd pulled off a platform was holding the most dangerous secret in the county. Crowder was stealing from you, Buck, she said, locking eyes with the man who had hunted her across town and prairie. 20%. Every deal. He kept it hidden in a false-bottom safe behind his desk. The color drained from Buck's face. $2,000. That was no small sum. It was enough to buy a ranch, hire a dozen men, or control half the county elections. And Cordelia knew exactly where it was hidden. But what struck Thaddeus more wasn't the money. It was her courage. This wasn't just about revenge or escape anymore. Cordelia was taking back her power not with a gun, but with her memory, her mind, her truth. Judge Crawford rode a few paces forward, rifle still steady in his grip. That's a serious accusation. Are you prepared to swear it under oath? Cordelia nodded. Yes, sir. And I'll name every date, every transaction. I copied the ledgers. They're hidden. Buck was still frozen, the truth unraveling everything he'd built on fear and favors. His men looked unsure now. Their guns hung lower. Their eyes darted not toward Thaddeus, but toward Crowder's name. Because Cordelia hadn't just exposed theft. She'd exposed betrayal. And in a world where loyalty was currency, that was unforgivable. Buck opened his mouth, but Judge Crawford cut him off. We'll be investigating the saloon immediately. But for now, Mr. Morrison, I suggest you consider your next words carefully. Attempted murder is still on the table. And just like that, the scales shifted. Cordelia, once powerless, now held the room. A girl no one had seen coming. A girl who'd been trained to be invisible, but who remembered everything. As the riders began to disperse and Buck's men withdrew, Cordelia turned back toward Thaddeus and Minerva. Her shoulders slumped for the first time all day, like someone setting down a weight they'd carried too long. I thought remembering it all would be the curse, she whispered to Thaddeus. But maybe it's the one thing that saves me. He didn't have words, just respect. And something deeper that he didn't yet know how to name. The danger, for now, had passed. But the road ahead would demand even more of them. The wind had changed. It wasn't sharp anymore. It was soft, like the kind that brushed through wheat fields on quiet mornings before anyone else woke. The kind that felt like a breath after a storm. Thaddeus guided the horse slowly down the path that led to his small farmstead, the sun beginning its descent behind the hills. Cordelia sat behind him in the saddle, her arms wrapped gently around his waist, not for closeness, but for grounding. To remind herself this was real, that she wasn't back in that saloon, that no one was shouting numbers at her anymore. And tucked in front of him, with her arms wrapped around his midsection like she had every right to be there, was Minerva, still a child, still full of light, but quieter now, thoughtful in a way that only children who'd seen too much became. No one spoke for the first hour. They didn't need to. Every hoofbeat over dry grass said, what words couldn't? You're safe now. You made it. You weren't alone after all. When the little white farmhouse finally came into view, Cordelia gasped. It wasn't big, wasn't new, but it stood. A porch with 2 old rocking chairs, a swing hanging from a crooked tree branch, faded curtains fluttering in the window like they were waving them home. It's not much, Thaddeus said softly, but it's honest, and it's mine. Cordelia didn't reply. She couldn't. Her throat felt too full. Because for the first time in years, she wasn't arriving somewhere to be used or hidden or made small. She was being brought home. They unsaddled in silence, each step heavy with fatigue. But inside the little kitchen was warm. The kettle still sat on the stove from that morning. Minerva yawned and climbed into the little bed in the corner without a word. Cordelia tucked a quilt around her without asking, and the child led her. Thaddeus watched it unfold like a dream. He never thought he'd live two souls, both wounded, falling into something that looked a lot like peace. "You sure you're all right?" he asked Cordelia quietly. She nodded, then paused. "No. But I'm better than I was yesterday." He nodded back. That was enough. Later, as the moon climbed high and coyotes howled in the far distance, Thaddeus sat out on the porch. The stars were sharp tonight, cold and clear. He heard the door creak open behind him. Cordelia stepped out, wrapped in a blanket. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "Didn't think you would." She sat beside him. For a long time they said nothing. Then she whispered, "Why'd you really do it? At the saloon? Why risk everything for a stranger?" Thaddeus leaned back and looked at the sky. "Because you weren't a stranger. You looked like someone waiting to be believed. And I've known that feeling." She looked down. Her fingers tightened around the edges of the blanket. "Thank you," she said, "for giving me something I thought I lost." "What's that? A place to belong?" He smiled, faint but true. Tomorrow would bring more. More questions, more decisions, maybe even more danger. But tonight, they had a roof, warm food, and the promise of rest. The town of Millfield had never seen its courthouse this full. The benches creaked under the weight of bodies, and the air hung heavy, not just with dust, but with expectation. Men had died in this town, for far less than what was about to be put on the record. And yet here sat Cordelia May, chin high hands, folded eyes steady. It had been 3 weeks since the auction. 3 weeks since her name was no longer whispered behind hands, but spoken out loud, sometimes with awe, sometimes with pity. But today Cordelia wasn't a victim. She wasn't even a survivor. She was the one who remembered everything. The courtroom doors opened, and Judge Crawford entered in his worn black coat, the hem frayed, the buttons dull. But the man inside the robe was made of granite. And he carried his gavel like it was the last word between justice and ruin. Cordelia's heart pounded as she took the witness chair. Across the aisle sat Silas Crowder, thinner now, paler, his signature smirk gone. Buck Morrison was absent, his name carved into every whispered conversation, but not the docket. The clerk swore her in, and the courtroom held its breath. Cordelia began. She told them about the ledgers, the forged debts, the names of girls auctioned off under false pretenses, the locked ledgers she'd memorized and rewritten by candlelight when no one was looking. Her voice never wavered. She didn't embellish. She didn't dramatize. She just told the truth, and in doing so took back the pieces of herself that had been stolen. Somewhere in the gallery, Thaddeus sat beside Minerva, holding her hand gently in both of his. He watched Cordelia not with pride, but with reverence. Like a man watching a sunrise he thought he'd never see again. When she finished, the room was so quiet, it felt sacred. Judge Crawford looked over his glasses and nodded once. "That'll do just fine." Silas Crowder didn't say a word. Because there was nothing left to say. The numbers didn't lie. The books matched her words. And every soul in that courtroom knew it. Cordelia stepped down her legs, shaking. But the moment her feet touched the floor, it was as if some unseen weight had lifted. She didn't look at Crowder as she passed him. He wasn't worth it. Outside, the town had gathered not to gawk, but to listen. She told the story again, this time under the courthouse steps, and this time as a free woman. "I kept the books," she said. "But I also kept my soul." People nodded. Some wept. And for the first time in a long time, the truth didn't just hurt. It healed. That night, back on the porch, with Thaddeus and Minerva, Cordelia sat quietly, the trial now behind her. The stars looked different. "You did something brave today," Thaddeus told her. She turned to him, voice soft. "I did something necessary." There was no fanfare, no music, no grand procession. Just a white linen dress hung to dry on the line the night before. and the soft rustle of prairie grass as the morning wind carried the scent of clover through the valley. Cordelia stood in the doorway of Thaddeus's farmhouse, her hands smoothing the fabric at her waist, not out of nervousness, but reverence. This wasn't just a wedding. It was the burial of every cruel name she'd been called, of every night spent afraid, of every shadow she thought she'd never escape. And it was the beginning of something she'd once believed would never be hers, a life freely chosen. Thaddeus waited for her under the old oak near the creek, the same tree where Sarah had once read to Minerva, and where Thaddeus had often come to think. He wore his only good shirt, the collar slightly crooked, and a wildflower in his pocket that Minerva had insisted on pinning there herself. The townsfolk came respectfully. Reverend Mills said the vows, in a voice touched with emotion, as if he too understood that this was more than a union of two people. It was the mending of two broken lives. Cordelia didn't cry during the ceremony, but Thaddeus did. A single tear slipped down his cheek when Cordelia placed her hand over his heart and whispered, "You made me believe in men again." After the ceremony, there was no feast, just warm bread from the neighbors, sweet jam from Miss Allen's pantry, and laughter from a girl who once thought her papa would never smile again. The farmhouse, still patched in places from the winter storm, now held 3 pairs of boots by the door. Cordelia's were small but sturdy. Her place was no longer temporary. She belonged. That night, after the guests had gone and Minerva had fallen asleep beneath a quilt Cordelia had sewn from scraps, the couple sat in silence on the porch. The stars stretched above them, bold and unashamed. "It's quiet," Cordelia said softly. "Quiet can be good." Thaddeus replied, taking her hand. "It used to scare me," she confessed, "made me feel like I didn't exist. But now, it feels like peace." He kissed her knuckles one by one. "That's because you're safe now." She leaned her head on his shoulder, breathing in the scent of wood smoke and earth and something else. Something she hadn't known in a long time home. The world beyond the fence was still hard. Men like Buck Morrison didn't vanish overnight, and justice was never truly finished. But in that little corner of Kansas, goodness had grown stubborn roots. And it had bloomed in the quiet, in the in-between moments where no one was watching. A promise was kept. A soul was restored. A family was born, not by blood, but by choice. And sometimes, that's the greatest victory of all. If this story moved you, subscribe for more tales of quiet courage and fierce love from the forgotten corners of the American West. And if you believe in second chances, click on the video next to this one, because the next story might just restore your faith in people all over again.